me just intro you a tiny bit.
Yeah, go for it.
Welcome to our, what is this, mid-November Patreon interview. Today we have Dr. Robert Cutrer, who is going to talk to us about dragons and perhaps get a little bit into dragons and royalty, which I think is a pretty interesting sub-subject there. But first of all, kick us off. Tell us what are we hearing about when we hear about dragons in Old Norse Icelandic lit?
Right. So that's the question. Right. So I did my master's thesis at Háskóli Íslands. Johanna was my supervisor, along with Torfi Tulinius, where we kind of started with that famous quote from Tolkien's Beowulf Monsters and the Credits: "Dragons, real dragons, essential both to the machinery and ideas of a poem or tale, are actually rare. In Northern literature, there are only two that are significant." In response to Chambers referring to the wilderness of dragons, talking about how there are too many dragons. And I was like, well, two seems like a really small number. I'm not sure if I accept that, but wilderness seems like a really big number. So we're going to try and work out what that means. And perhaps one of the bigger, more important questions is when that means. Because when we talk about Icelandic literature, majority of the time, or when we say Old Norse literature, we usually are talking about literature written in Iceland, usually 13th century or later. But when we talk about dragons, we're wanting to talk about events that happened during the Age of Migration, so 5th to 7th century, continental Europe, as well as a few exceptions that go a bit broader. But generally, when we talk about dragons, most people think about Fafnir and Midgardsormr. So we're in this kind of Norse mythic realm. And so we have to say, well, how can we know about dragons when the majority of written literature, all written literature, is basically 300, 400, 500 years after they were even practicing these things? And so what I try to do in my PhD, I try and divide this into what I call the indigenous dragons, which is not a very good term, but pre-Christian is better what it is, then what the advent of Christianity does to affect those stories. And then the big third big point is the advent of Romance literature, continental Anglo-Norman romance. So we get kind of rough time periods, understanding that there's a lot of interplay with them before, right? Iceland converts to Christianity in 1000 AD, according to Icelanders in the history they wrote about themselves. Take that or leave it as you want. We have literature start showing up, written literature in the mid 12th century, 1150s. I think our earliest remnant fragment is 1180. It's a homily book. So everything that we have written in manuscript form is by Christians. And then Romance literature comes on the scene under King Hákon and Gamli, who took the throne in 1217, and 1226 is when we can firmly date the first major Romance translated into Norse. So those are the key dates that we talk about, and then we talk about how those are going to affect everything. And so, all right, we want to talk about dragons before Christianity existed, but we have no saga literature that we can firmly date to it. We've got the Eddic poetry, which everyone loves, but there's got to be more we can do from that. And so my approach was cultural memory, which Jan Asman, a great Egyptologist, kind of put forward first, which is that everyone has a shared idea of what these words mean by how we interact with it, right? Every day in festive remembering, just as written culture is. In non-literate cultures, cultural memory does not cling to so single-mindedly to text. Dances, plays, rites, masks, images, rhythms, melodies, food and drink, spaces and places, costumes, tattoos, jewelry, weapons, they all belong to the formative festive self-realization and the festive self-assertion. So every bit of evidence we have comes to build this kind of semantic field around the word dragon, we might say. So when I say dragon now, people are very likely thinking of Smaug. They're thinking of Baldur's Gate 3. They're thinking of Morrowind, Elder Scrolls, right? We've got the fantasy dragon that we all can interact with and know. We're going to try and figure out what the word dragon, and there's not one word, is another one of those fun things I like to talk about, meant pre-Christian and then post-Christian. Jonathan Evans, wonderful approach to this on the semiotics of medieval dragon tradition, right? They're not interested in, they're interested in characters, creatures, events, locations, and objects, not an abstraction like form classes. The structuralists who did a lot of great work had this idea of the dragon is the monster. It fits here. We can remove it and replace it with another one. And it doesn't quite work that way. So we have to understand why we're picking a dragon for these things. And so how can we begin to understand dragons in Iceland? Because that's where our literature is coming from. I always like to start, there was a great chapter by Niels Horrebow, The Natural History of Iceland, that very famously Samuel Johnson could quote from memory the entirety of the chapter of snakes in Iceland. No snakes of any kind are to be met throughout the whole island, right? So it's a further ridiculousness we have going is that there are no snakes in Iceland. So they're writing about a creature that they don't even interact with regularly.
Sure.
Which, from Texas and Australia, we know snakes. We know dangerous snakes. We know deadly snakes. A few weeks ago, I ran into a 6-foot-long rattlesnake here. I was super excited. Everyone else was terrified. I was like, oh no, look, he's adorable. He shakes his tail when he doesn't want us close. It's fine. But Icelanders, they don't know what snakes are. And let's be fair, Northern Europe doesn't really do dangerous snakes either.
But there's something in Scandinavia, right? Okay, yeah.
There are three snakes.
You're anticipating me, yeah.
Well, no. But that's the important question. There are 3 snakes / 3.5, because there's also a lizard with no legs that they call a snake in Scandinavia and Norway. So we have the grass snake, the smooth snake, the slow worm, and the adder. The only venomous snake in Northern Europe is the common adder, which is relatively not venomous at all as far as snakes go. I don't think anyone has died in over 80 years from an adder bite in England. It's just not really a dangerous snake when we're used to things that will kill us much, much faster in Australia, Texas, Florida, the southern US, right? We've got great snakes. But snakes are such weird creatures when you really think about them, right? They've got no legs, but they can climb. They can swim, they live underground, they eat things larger than themselves. They're a very baffling creature. Mm-hmm. And so from a natural perspective, we have to, these stories of snakes are circulating, they understand them. And it's just a really confusing creature because they're inherently what we'd call a chthonic creature. They're an earthen creature, but they do climb trees, they do swim, they do all sorts of things. So then we kind of look at, well, what do we mean with the word dragon, the word snake? And so the word dreki, which is our word for dragon in Old Norse, it's from the Latin draco, which comes from the Greek drachon. And drachon is an aorist past participle of derchomai, which refers to the flashing of the eyes or seeing clearly. So in the oldest forms of the word dreki, back in ancient Greek, and if you couldn't tell, I was a class assistant undergrad, so I always try and sneak my Homer back in. I just
approved.
So the watchfulness of the eyes, these terrifying eyes, is such an important thing. And we'll circle back to this when we talk about kingship, because this is that key factor, I think. And then our other word for snake in Norse is ormur, which is the Indo-European ermi, ermo, meaning to turn. And I think that's a great word for what a snake is, something that doesn't have a kind of solid body. It folds in on itself. It's always wiggly and writhing. And so these are kind of the 2 big ideas that we have when we think about snakes and dragons, is they are formless or relatively formless, and they have terrifying eyes because snakes can't blink. So the great thing is, even when snakes are sleeping, their eyes are open. So it makes sense that in Greek mythology, they're always the guardians of treasure. We have Python and the dragon of the Hesperides. There's a dragon with the golden fleece. Argus is serpentine, because snakes always have their eyes open. So they appear to never be sleeping. Though you can't, for record, anyone snake hunting, you can tell how awake a snake is by how active their tongue is. Which is what they're using to sense the environment. So when they're sleeping, they're not going to be flicking their tongue.
That's a very interesting point about the unblinkingness of snakes being a really striking, eerie thing to observe, and as a trait that you would want hypothetically in a watcher, right?
Yeah. No. There's that great quote by Queen Elizabeth I, where she says, I see, but I don't speak, as this veiled threat of, just because I don't tell you I'm seeing it, I'm always watching. There's this clear idea that rulers need to be aware of everything going on. And so there's a real strong connection with snakes as these guardians, these watchers, these ever-present minds. And snakes are very bizarre in that they're the most common figure in artwork and pre-Christian artwork throughout Scandinavia, right? We've got a great little snake buckle here, but they are the least common totemic animal in terms of names. They only show up in nicknames for skalds, and the Heiti are all connected to Odin. So they only show up in this kind of Odinic capacity. And I put a star next to they're only present in nicknames and traits. Technically, Grettir, also, which is a great name, refers to the smile of a snake, right? A snake's mouth or a serpentine smile is what Grettir refers to, which is why when Grettir has a bunch of trouble with people whose name is Thor, there's that hilarious play going on between this snake and Thor dynamic going on.
And
so
and I note too, just you probably you've anticipated this, I'm sure, but Odin turns into a snake once.
The only one who shapeshifts, the only Aesir who shapeshifts into a snake. The only other snake shapeshifting in the mythic past is Fafnir. And so yeah, Odin is a baffling person, character, identity, and it's also important to note Odin is seemingly entirely unknown when Iceland is settled. There are 0 place names in Iceland with Odinic connections. He's very much a Danish deity, which makes sense because of the kind of Germanic Woden places that we know. He seems to have made his way up with Skaldic poetry, and then we think of Odin as the chief and most important of the gods because Snorri Sturluson, a skald, talks about how great the god of Skaldic poetry is. So like we have to kind of keep in mind what's going on with all of this as we try and untangle where these beliefs came from, what they used to believe. And so, right, we talked about the unblinking eyes of snakes. The other key aspect we know of snake is their tongues, right? They've always got their tongues out because snakes are using their Jacobson's organs to sense and detect heat and find prey. But for people who, don't know advanced modern age biology, they're just always licking the air, which is very bizarre, and probably where we get this Skaldic connection, who speak with their tongue. It's so important. And in a lot of the early bracteates that we get from Scandinavia, they really highlighted these tongues that we've got here. Let's see if I can pull up my annotation cursor. Yeah. So
while you're doing that,
left. Oh, sorry. What?
Say, I was really struck when you said that, when you mentioned how often they come up in art in this period. I had never thought about that before, but just the occurrence on runestones is the ribbon that the runes are in.
Yeah, the encircler, right? That
yeah.
Which is what the word Fafnir means. So it's right. they encircle, they encompass. They're this great kind of beginning and end point because they can wrap on themselves. So our early bracteates, right? We've got a mysterious. They're modified Roman coins made into necklaces, but we've got this figure here on the left. His tongue is sticking out. He's got a raven hanging around him. We have a figure on the right on a multi-legged horse with a raven hanging out, and his tongue is fully extended. There's no names or words on this, so we have to, be careful how we interpret them. But clearly, the tongue is an important part of this depiction. And then we've got the famous helmets, the Valsgard and the Vindel helmet plates. What exactly they are telling us there is another question, right? In Valsgard, the snakes are marching in file with our troops who are wearing eagle-crested helmets. In the Vindel plate, the chthonic snake is very clearly on the ground, tongue extended, in opposition to this rider who's got both an eagle and a raven while wearing an eagle helmet. What does this all mean? That's a great mystery that we're still trying to work. But snakes are still even present as figures, not as just this abstract ribbon. And then, of course, you mentioned the rune stones, and those are, of course, super important. Very famously, the Ramsund stone, where a man named Sigurður had a memorial made to him, and they're like, wouldn't it be great if we put the Sigurður myth on his grave? And they put this gigantic, like 20-foot long carving where we've got outside of the ribbon our hero impaling the dragon with its face wrapped around. And then probably, and I say probably because there's no specifics here, a form of the myth of Sigurður and Fafnir. And then to the right, this is from the Derby Cross in the Isle of Man, where they were early converters to Christianity. So they were utilizing a lot of local ideas on their crosses to convey Christian Christian ideas. And so it's, even though it's not in Iceland, this was a Viking settled area. And on the Derby Cross, we've got clearly a gigantic snake being impaled by a warrior, again, probably Sigurður, since our only other mythic dragon is the Midgardsormr, and Thor never uses a sword. So these two early depictions, pre-Christian depictions, show us kind of an idea of how dragons look and feel, right? We've got no wings, we've got no legs. Those are much later additions. This hooked beak from the Derby Cross, I find really interesting. There's some connection to a much later saga that's set much earlier, which is Ketil Saga Heinz. I don't know if you're familiar. Ketil Heinger's, he lives in northern Norway. They breed with the Sami people. His son was Grim Ironcheek Lothenkinna. Their descendants are where Eoskata Grimson and Snorri Sturluson. So they're a huge family in Iceland. And in his saga, which sadly we only have in a much later form, 15th century, he gets the nickname trout, Hangr, or salmon, it's the same fish to them, for killing a dragon. But the dragon that we get in the saga is very clearly a late Romance dragon. And so we kind of wonder what, if there was an older form of it, what it would have looked like. And that hooked mouth is a very interesting one to deal with. But we've also got a lot of other snakes and runes that we don't know what to deal with.
And as far as Ketil Hungr, I was just thinking, isn't it that it's trolls, right? Because there's Sami people in those stories too, but isn't it trolls?
It's this. They use the word Finn and troll interchangeably in Ketil Saga and Grimm Saga. So Trot, one of those. Finn, and I say Sami because that's clearly there is some real connection with the Sami people there, but it tells you how the Norwegians feel about the indigenous Sami people, because they use the word Halbjorn Haftrot very famously. Is Ketil's father, who forbids him from being with this Finnish woman whom he loves, even though his name is Half Troll. Clearly, the family has already partaken of this. And that saga is a fascinating one because it deals with what is allowed to try and survive in the barren north and what is taboo. And it's like cannibalism is where they draw the line. Because one of the trolls, he has a bunch of fish, but at the bottom of it is human flesh. And so they destroy all of the fish and human flesh because that's a line that they refuse to cross, is this very serious taboo.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trilogy of sagas, of course, concluding with the D&D campaign, which is Arrow Odd Saga.
And there's also On Saga Bolvegus, which shows up, which is basically Robin Hood in Norse. Like I love the Hrafnistamen. I think it's absolutely some fascinating sagas that always need more work.
What I was going to say, just in bringing this up, was thinking about them and trolls is, I mean, if you read, and I know you have Arman Jakobsson on that word troll, I mean, that's a pretty big category. And I was wondering if there's something in the presence of a serpent or dragon in a story that also prominently, just again and again and again, mentions trolls, right? This is part of sort of one domain, right? The troll and the serpent.
No, it's interesting. Serpents are in this very kind of fully monstrous category, interestingly, whereas Trot is kind of one of those very liminal figures. But we do see, the closest we get is in Hrolf Saga Kraki, where we have a hideous Trot show up on Yule, and then it's just it's a dragon because it has wings and it flies, but it's really not a dragon. That seems to be a later author's addition to it, because it's identical to the two trolls from all of the Bear Sons tales. So it's the same as Grendel's scene. It's the same as Grettir and the two trolls at Sandhauger. And so this great troll, shows up, but we do kill the troll, and then drinking his blood causes that fearlessness that we know eating a dragon heart comes from Sigurður and Gudrun.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that's the most mixed creature.
Interesting. Yeah, I translated the saga and I hadn't even remembered that the word dragon was used for that. Because the image that you get from it is so far from being a dragon.
I always feel like it's the Balrog from Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, where it's like a guy with a lion head and wings taped on its back, because it's very much a chimeric monster that's not quite put together correctly in the form we get Hrolf Saga. I love it, but it's like it's really much more of a chimeric creation there.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the word is being, this word is bouncing around, at least for fairly late medieval editors, in a multivalent enough sense that you can apply it to lots of different creatures like that, where that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case in these earlier texts, where it does seem like something very snake-like.
Yeah, no, for sure. The later you get, the kind of looser trot becomes as kind of a catch-all word for the supernatural and the other and witchcraft, right? I think the more Christian the mentality becomes of how they understand the world, where there's a clear good and evil, then trot kind of becomes a more encompassing word for everything that's not holy, we might say, in the later works. But yeah, like, are dragons a bad thing in the early works? Well, the Midgardsormr, Thor wants to kill him, and he's a problem at the end of the world, but otherwise he's encircling and keeping everything contained and together. And so I mentioned we've got other snakes. We have this very famous runestone, Hunestad 3, where we've got a woman riding on a wolf, using a snake as the reins, wielding a snake, her tongue is a snake, and above her head is a bunch of woven snakes.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, well, there's that myth of the woman who rides up on a wolf. Well, maybe. But why is her tongue a full snake? Is the woven roof of snakes reminiscent of Naustrond, that kind of really, really bad place in hell where all the walls are snakes and it's venom dripping everywhere? I don't know. That's the fun. And then earliest... Oh, go ahead.
Or is she just your goth girlfriend from college?
Yeah, exactly. Riding up on that tricked out wolf, you're ready to go. She's really flexing there with that. And then the wolf it's got like bird talons. Is that intentional? Is that just the artist not knowing what wolf paws look like? It's a mystery. So interestingly, in the earliest rune stones, snakes seem to be overwhelmingly kind of depicted in this important point to the solar idea. So there's two encircling snakes located always below, west and east of this sun. And probably, we're getting into theoretical reigns here, there was some form of sun worship going on, and then the snakes as encirclers would kind of carry and move this. But then something mysterious happened in the 560s, which is to say, the volcanic eruption that caused a 3-year winter and everyone's crops to fail. And then a sun religion entirely dies out. Presumably the absence of the sun for 3 years made people think maybe this isn't the religion for us. But then these runestones stick around and people no longer know what these symbols mean because this religion died. And so then we've got this added layer going on of pre-Viking religion, and how they're interpreting these ancient standing stones in the same way that the Anglo-Saxons saw Neolithic mounds and were like, oh, clearly Wayland the blacksmith lives there, and made up their own kind of ancient stories about them. So that's playing into all of it as well, to make everything confusing. But thankfully, we do have one literary source that we can look to that usually gets overlooked. And that's Skaldic poetry. And we overlook it because it's miserably complicated and designed to be confusing, which just means that I love it because it's like a puzzle. And so what I just want to do is walk through my favorite Skaldic poem that I think this is going to be a bold take here, the best form of the Sigurður story that is preserved. Yeah.
Right. That's a
hot take here.
Yeah.
but you'll see at least why I appreciate it so much. So the great thing about Skaldic poetry is it's all about fame. So we know usually the author of every Skaldic poem. Unlike most medieval texts where we don't know the author, Skalds are like, yeah, slap my name all over this. Everyone needs to know it was me. And so the poem we're going to look at is by Thjodolfr Arnarsson, who actually know a fair amount about. He was the royal skald for Magnus and Gothi and Haraldr Hardraði. He died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge alongside Haraldr. So very much a Viking, lived a fantastically fascinating life, and he wrote a ton of poetry. In the Skaldic poetry verse, we have the Magnus Floker, the Danaveldi, Runhind, Sextefja, Leithanger for Haraldr Sigurðarson, and then a lot of Loisavither and fragments. And so as Morkinstina is passed down to us, which we have to accept is going to be an embellished story, but the way the story goes is they're walking down the streets of Norway one day when Haraldr Hardraði hears a commotion and sees a bar fight taking place, right? Good old Viking scene. Two patrons get into a fist fight. And he looks to Thjodolfr and he says, all right, it's time to prove how good of a skald you are. Write me a poem about that bar fight. But elevate it to the mythic level and tell me the story of Thor and Geirröðr. So he, on the spot, has to compose a story of Thor and Geirröðr about these two drunk men getting into a bar fight. And he succeeds at it marvelously. He's like, good job, but do the same story for me now, but make it about Sigurður and Fafnir. So he creates a Skaldic story about a bar fight between a drunk blacksmith and either cobbler or leather tanner, someone who works with leather, in this fashion. And so I'm going to break everything we learned from this relatively simple and wildly unimportant Skaldic poem down, because there's just so much rich about it. So Sigurður eggjaði sleggju, snauk váligar brákar, en skaftreki skinna skreith of leste heithi, min sósk orm áður inni, Ilvegs búin kilju, noit leiðar á naðri, neplangar konungar tangar. And so I, for the sake of everyone, put it in regular Norse below, but you'll see that the word order, as far as Skaldic poetry goes, is pretty standard and straightforward, which lends some credence to this was a spontaneously created poem rather than something he spent 8 hours working on to really make it complicated. Now, what this means, very simply, the Sigurður of the sledgehammer, which is our kinning for blacksmith, incited or egged on, I love the word eggjaði, the snake of the dangerous scraping tool. So one who uses a scraping tool is a tanner, and a snake is a dangerous person. So that's our kinning. So our first two lines are, the blacksmith angered the tanner. That good Skaldic saying a lot about nothing. The scraping dragon of the skins, another kinning for tanner, slithered across the covering or the heath of the feet. And the heath of the feet is the floor. People were afraid of the reptile clad in the covering of the soul path, which is the covering of the soul path is leather, and the covering, leather, the covering of that would be shoes. And so the reptile wearing shoes is going to be this leather maker or this cobbler. Before the long-nosed king of the tongs, our blacksmith, overcame the adder of the ox leather. So all this poem says is the blacksmith angered the tanner. The tanner ran across to pick a fight and everyone was scared until the blacksmith beat up the tanner. Nothing happens important at all in this Skaldic poem. So this is entirely a point for our Skald Thjodolfr to kind of flex his mythic muscles and show how great he is. And the first thing we can notice is he gets 4 entirely separate words for snake in one single Skaldic poem. He's got snauk, Drekki, Orm, and Nadri. Right, so he is using not every different form, but 4 of the largest forms of snake, all of which still exist in modern English, which I think is fascinating. Right, Snauker is snake, and Drekki is dragon, Orm is worm, and Nadri is where the word natter comes from, because unlike English, we keep ins on the beginning of words in Old Norse, instead of making it an adder. So he's using these 4 separate words to give us a broad and diverse idea of Fafnir, the greatest dragon of mythic stories. He encompasses all of them. And his choice in how he uses them is equally important, right? Snauk is a great word, first of all. Snauker comes from sniffing. So the origin of the word, the etymology of the word has to do with this sniffing, this detecting sense, which snakes do with their tongue, and is related to that great word stonk. In Beowulf, when the dragon first goes out, stonk over Stain, when he's detecting sense in the presence of Beowulf, the dragon is using kind of that same Proto-Indo-European connected word. So the beginning of a snake's approach would be one where he's trying to detect his threats, sniff them, and that's what the Snauk does. And then we have Dreki, that watchfulness, that aggressiveness, the guardianship we've talked about. Orm is just that great word meaning snake, the binder, the wrapper, the encompasser of things. And then Naudri is a fascinating word. It's actually another loan word from Latin, from nato natare, to swim, because snakes are known for swimming, and the adder is a great swimmer. And the common grass snake, which I mentioned of the 3 snakes of Scandinavia, his scientific name is Natrix natrix, the swimming one, because they're water snakes.
Huh. I'm just surprised it's such a seemingly obscure word as a borrowing.
Yeah. So Natter makes it, I mean, when it comes in is probably much earlier. We're probably in Proto-Germanic when we get Natter from Natri, but that's where it originally comes. So Dreki and Navri are both in their origins loanwords, but Dreki shows up
Dreki.
super early.
Yeah, Dreki, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's interesting too that, you know, what is the shade of meaning that you're getting by borrowing, you know, Dreki, when you've already got worm, right? When you've already got snake, right? What's the semantic field that's being covered by this loan word?
Exactly. And so, yeah, that's like, and skalds are the best to know it. Like Roberta Frank kind of goes into detail. No Haiti is identical, right? Every word is chosen specifically for some degree of nuanced meaning. It's never just, well, Bernard Knox, another great classical writer, says if you're saying Homer picks a word because he has to do it for the meter, you're belittling his ability as a poet. He is intentionally crafting and choosing his words. So we can't ever just fall back to, well, we needed a wide A in line 2, so Snauk was the only choice. He wanted to use Snauk, and he made the line work by doing ow for all 3 of the words. And so all of this,
and he's showing off. I mean,
well,
that's
yeah,
part of it too. Yeah.
Yeah, he wants everyone to know, oh yeah, I'm talking about a bar fight, 4 words for dragon right here. Really flexing on him. That's why I love this poem, because it's such an arrogant piece from Thjodolfr, and that's what we expect from our skalds. And then the word itself, right? We know the story of Sigurdur and Fafnir, right? Sigurdur kills the dragon, gains the hoard, maybe gains other stuff. There's all sorts of confusion in that. And so we know from the get-go, the beginning of the poem, Sigurdur is our hero. He's mentioned first, so we know that's who's going to win the fight. He is the first and the last line of the Skaldic poem. And also at the turn of the Helminger is our verb that matters, inni, he overcomes. So Sigurdur, inni, and konungur, right, we say are our 3 main words, lets us know who the main character is, who the victor is, and focuses the poem on him. And we also know one of the biggest and scariest things about dragons is they're really, really big. So now we can look at how much of the poem is dedicated to our Fafnir figure, right? It is the entirety of the rest of the poem. The majority of the poem is taken up by speaking either directly about or verbs connected to our snake, our dragon here. With, again, the central Helminger turn is my favorite piece because it tells us everything we need to know about dragons and dragon slaying. Min sousk orm, men fear the dragon, auðr inni, until he overcomes them. That one line tells us everything we need to know, right? It goes back to Calvert Watkins' How to Kill a Dragon, that kind of proto-Indo-European hero slay dragon construction. We've got here why men are scared of the dragon until our hero, who's mentioned in line 1, overcomes him. Dragon slayers save men from fear. And fear is really what dragons are all about. There's a great article by Armin Jacobsen, Enter the Dragon, because he likes to put Bruce Lee references into his article. He just loves pop culture references, and I agree with him on that one. Where he talks about how fear is the central aspect of dragons. More than gold, more than power, it's a matter of fear. In Faufnismal, Sigurður, it's all about overcoming fear, being fearless, getting the Helm of Terror, which is that connection to, right, Scandinavian royalty as well, right? A king needs to be fearless, which is why they would embody this serpentine nature, this serpentine helm. And so this poem contains that. And then, just again, because our skald is going to flex, the acoustics, the mimetic expression within this poem tell us the story itself, right? We begin with this beautiful alliteration, Sigurregja the slegju snauk valigar brauker in skaftreki skinna skreith. We've got this beautiful hiss of these S's throughout the entire beginning where our snake is attacking. And as the snake attacks, right, we mentioned snakes swallow things bigger. So the giant open gaping maw, we have all open vowels. Sosk orm auder inni ilvegs. Right, and snauk, vauligar, brauker. We've got all these big open vowels to see how big and scary the snake is. And then as he's punched down, we have Neuteleder zaunader in Neplanger, Konungar, Tunger. We've got this great voiced alveolar nasal here at the end, going on to break everything up and just create this dissonant destruction of the snake. Right, so I mentioned Snauk Vauligar Brauker. I love as he runs across the floor. We've got this big open mouth scariness of the serpent. And so within this really simple 8-line poem about the most inconsequential event in the history of Haraldr Hardraði, 2 drunk men in a bar fight in Norway, we know everything we need to know about dragons. Their fear is their central aspect. They are large and dangerous, but Sigurður overcomes them fearlessly. And so that's why it's a bold take, but why I love this poem so much, because there's just so much contained in it. And that's the joy of Skaldic poetry is, you can spend 10, 20 hours and still pick up on more of the craft of this artist.
Yeah, the S's alliterating in that first stanza, half stanza, have got to be intentional for exactly the reason you mentioned. That's pretty cool.
Yep. And then again, this last line, or the second to last line, Neuteleder Nadri, is him flexing, because we mentioned Nadri is a swimming snake specifically, and Neuteleder refers to an ox. And the poem right before this was about Thor. So now we're talking about dragons and ox hides in the water. And so he's making an allusion back to his previous poem about Thor and the Midgard serpent as well, just because Thjodolfr wants to let everyone know he's really good at his job. He is, according to Morkinskinna, rewarded very handsomely for these poems, and I think that's well deserved. But yeah, so that's a lot of what I've been trying to do in the early part before I get into all of the Christian and the Romance influences, which I think are equally fascinating. But looking at kind of what is happening with Skaldic poetry is one of the biggest areas we can kind of recover a lot that wasn't picked up, because the structuralists don't care at all. Didn't care at all about this. So a lot of the early dragon scholarship completely ignores these kinds of pieces. And Skaldic poetry is very hard to track down. We're very lucky that Taryn Wills and the Skaldic Poetry Project has basically put all of it together in one giant 8-volume tome for us to work through all of it. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I'm working on. And then, if you want me to talk about Snake Eyes and Norwegian Rule, I can jump into that now. Or if you want to chat about something else, whatever floats your boat.
I'd be interested to hear about this. Are there questions, remarks from Patreon folks who are here? Let's pause and see if anybody wants to get some further context. Stella has been putting a lot of links to various papers you've mentioned along the way.
Oh, wonderful.
So if people want to follow up on that, check the chat. All right, I don't see immediate questions. I apologize to a degree for my asides and interruptions. Just
No,
thinking
please.
out loud as I listen to you.
No, this is supposed to be a chat. I don't want to just monopolize time and talk about. I mean, I will because I love talking about snakes and dragons. But
Yeah, well,
anytime you
actually,
want to like ask a question or jump in, please don't hesitate. It's just I will talk until someone interrupts me about this. So it's
okay.
fine.
Well, intermission question here. You were expressing so much snake patriotism earlier. Seems like you have some actually strong feelings about snakes. What's with your interest in snakes? What's
So
what drew you to this?
yeah, fair. So originally, before when I was going into college, herpetology was going to be my major. I was
Oh,
going to
damn.
focus
Okay.
entirely on reptiles. But then I met a girl and she was interested in medieval literature. So I swapped up to try and impress her. Um, I've been married to her for 20 years though. So it worked out
Whoa.
really well for me.
Whoa. Okay.
I always like to pause for a second. They're like, why would you do that? I'm like, no, it's okay. It's great.
Yeah, I
Um,
was about to say medieval literature impress a girl. But okay, it
so,
worked.
no, my wife's amazing. She's a PhD student at Oxford right now. She does early Irish monastic law.
Wow.
So our poor daughter has to deal with that around the dinner table.
Hmm.
But so I mean, I always loved literature. And so I changed gears into literature. Originally went and thought I was going to be a classicist, did 39 credit hours of Homeric Greek in undergrad. And then I was like, man, I really don't enjoy classical scholarship. Which is to say, I didn't want like there was nothing I wanted to write on that I felt that was still open. And I'd loved Norse literature, and I had a degree in English as well. So I did. Obviously, Beowulf is amazing, and everyone loves Beowulf. But Beowulf is also, as you know, you mentioned with your last interview with Tom Shippey, Beowulf is such a full pool already that I would feel like I would just be regurgitating something at that stage. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, okay, there's so much in Norse. We're never going to run out of material in Norse to cover, especially because I'm interested in all sorts of the lesser known sagas. One of my favorite sagas to talk about is Ingvar Saga Vithvorla, which is
Deep
terrible
cut.
fan fiction. It's just like the worst Saints Life ever written by Saints Life standards. But that's why I love it, because Oder Snorrason is trying so hard to make this great Icelandic mission voyage. But yeah, so originally, like I spent all of my youth studying reptiles. Obviously, I grew up in Texas, so lots of time around water moccasins and copperheads and rattlesnakes, loved lizards, the horned toad and the anoles. And so then when I got into literature, I was like, okay, well, I can talk about monsters. Dragons are fascinating. There's plenty of that in Greek. And then in Norse, I was like, okay, well, we got some great dragon stuff here. So I kind of
Hmm.
just paired my childhood love of reptiles with my adult love of literature and kind of found this nice little place of scholarship to just talk about dragons. I mean, I talk about other monsters too, but dragons fascinate me because I love snakes and I also love monsters, and they just hit both those pieces.
Okay. Another question at the intermission here. I was interested in everything you said about the physical characteristics and behavior of snakes and how they contribute to them being kind of a scary or at least notable, remarkable animal. I was wondering if you see those kind of patterns reoccurring ecumenically, like do Mesoamerican serpents, do Chinese serpents have similar, are people noticing the same things, the unblinkingness, the the eerie ability to climb trees? I mean, do these motifs recur elsewhere?
Yeah, so snakes are fascinating because they show up in every culture because snakes are very good at getting around, ironically lacking limbs. Um, so the number, like there's I would say Bloom is the author. He's from the University of Hawaii, wrote a piece on kind of a global approach to dragons. Um, and the big connection with all serpents is they're always next to sources of water. And sources of water is an important point, kind of makes them have a guardianship to them. Um, I'm always wary when talking, because when we talk about dragons in China. We're not really talking about dragons. We're really talking about mammals with reptilian traits. They're a little more chimeric. And
Okay.
dragon was the Western word we stuck on them
Sure.
to try and fast hand it. So not everyone does it, and I just say like we want to be careful because they're more mammalian first, and then they're serpentine second, rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And there's also a very clear distinction, kind of in snakes, on whether or not it is a cattle culture or an agrarian culture. So if they're a herding culture, snakes are almost always exclusively evil. Snakes are a problem because snakes will accidentally bite a cow because cows are stupid and then the cow can die. And that loss of your food is a real serious problem. But if you're a farming culture, an agrarian culture, snakes eat rodents and rodents destroy crops. So snakes are a blessing and a good thing.
Hmm.
So Romans use snakes as totems of protection all over the place. Roman jewelry has snakes everywhere. Women wore all sorts of snake jewelry as kind of a protective totem because they saw snakes as this warding and protective spirit. Whereas once we go into cattle-based cultures or herds-based cultures like the Greeks, right, they focused on goats. Snakes are dangerous, they're deadly because they kill your food source. And so it's really interesting to see that harsh dichotomy between snakes on whether or not they are attacking your food or they're protecting your food.
I see. Interesting.
Which is really fascinating. But the watchfulness of snakes, at least in Indo-European everything, is their number one defining trait. We see it as far back as Homer. We see it all throughout the Romans and like Aesop's fables. Even it shows up. There's a dragon watching over the gold. We don't see it in Irish because the Irish don't have snakes. And then the hilarious, like, I love how that came from them misusing a Norse word, because originally Columba on the Isle of Iona drove all the snakes out. But then Patrick's familia decided that he needed to be the better saint. So they took the story, and because the Irish name Patrick is Padraig, and the Norse word for snake and toad is poder, or poder, the connection between the two meant that Padraig was a much clearer one to get rid of the snakes because of the homonymic nature of his name. And the myth of Patrick doesn't show up until the 12th, 13th century. It's very late. Whereas Columbus is in his life, so 8th, 9th century. I want to say maybe 7th. I think Adamnan's the one who wrote it. So that's a question for my wife to get those dates right. But otherwise, snakes don't really feature in Irish stories because they're not in Ireland.
Makes sense. Well, if you don't mind taking the time, I'd be interested in what you have to say about snake eyes and Norwegian rule.
Yeah, no, I am more than happy to.
Because this comes up a lot, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we hear about so and so has snake-like eyes. I mean, it comes up in Riksthula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then that's the oldest piece. Which, speaking of Rigsthula, the name is stolen from Old Irish, which is even more confusing for everything. So with snake eyes, right? I mentioned they're focused, they're unblinking. We even have that great scene in Ulfljótslo, the first laws of Iceland, where you have to take your dragon masthead down so the eyes aren't looking at the land because it'll scare the landviter. So we know the eyes are this powerful thing about snakes. And then it's the mark of a noble bloodline as well, right? Because the trait of fearlessness is innate and it's a mark of noble blood. And the nobles, at least in the later writings, always get connected back to Odin. Odin is kind of the progenitor of noble families, which is why it's probably likely Rigsthula was originally talking about Odin, but because Heimdall has one of the Heiti as Rieger, they transferred it to him. But Heimdall doesn't really make a lot of sense there. There seems to be some confusion. But we see like the author of Volsunga Saga specifically crafts Odin as the central figure in the entire family line, from both the genesis of it to the maintaining of the line to ensure this perfect Odinic kingship goes down. He's the only Aesir with snake Haiti, so it's very clearly a mark of only Odin. It can't. Thor has terrifying eyes that make people jump in terror, but they're not snake eyes. He's also, we talked about when he transforms into a snake in order to get the meat of poetry, this wisdom, this super numinous knowledge, we might say, in a mythic sense. So Odin has otherworldly knowledge and the mark of nobility. And so then we first see this in the oldest Eddic poem, Rigsthula, where Jarl, which is the name of all noble people, right, his race are marked out by their Irmlingi Oyu, their tiny snake eyes, as in the eyes of tiny snakes because they're kids, not because they have tiny eyes, which would not be a very kingly trait, I think. Right, but so these snake-like eyes in Rigsthula, and we see similarly in Faufnismal, the Fran Egi Svein, the shining-eyed boy, as a reference to Sigurður and having these piercing, powerful eyes. And it shows up again, Ragnar Lothbroker, when speaking of Sigurður, says, Ormur I Oya in Anan let Svelta. So he's naming his son Sigurður, snake in the eye, after his father-in-law, because we're going with the Oslaugar story in this one, who also had the eye of a snake because he killed another snake. So the mark of fearlessness in Sigurður is from killing this snake and giving him these serpentine eyes. And thus, as Sigurður, snake in the eye, Ormarioya, is in the same boat, he gets this name, this appellation to him. But it's not just the Sigurður family, which is, of course, one of the most important families, but we also see it in the Fernaldr Sogar Hjálmthis Saga of Ulvis, where we've got the young king Hjálmthar, who didn't know he was a noble, and then they say, oh, you've got Ormfran Oyu. That's how he's recognized as a noble, because he's got those snake flashing eyes. You can't trust them. And we also have it attached with the Jarls of Norway. Jarl Haukon, Sigurdur's son, is a great example. Bjarni Biskup in his poem says that he has the Ormfran Oyu, right? The snake flashing eyes of men as he's stirring against them. Because he just went and sacrificed his own child in order to get good winds. And so he's got a terrible pagan person, but with them are his snake flashing eyes, a mark of his power and the terror of him. But it's not just wicked pagan people. So also Olafur and Helgi, another great king, with the Oyu Ormfron, right? The men of Trondelag do not dare to look into his snake-bright eyes, the lord of the Herser. It's this mark of power and inflicting terror while not being afraid. Right, so then I mentioned Armin Jakobsen's Enter the Dragon. He says, when it comes to the dynastic dragon slayers, Sigurdur and Ragnar, they are without fear. Right, Sigurdur was neither afraid nor scared of that clash of noise. Nothing scares him about it. And Fafnir is symbolic of fear because he wears the helmet of terror, the Aegis Helm he wore among sons of men while he laid upon neck rings. And we know that Fafnismal, while utilized for narrative threads in Volsunga Saga, itself was probably a performative piece. Terry Gunnell talks a lot about this in his work on the performative nature of Eddic poetry, which means that Fafnismal was very likely a manhood initiation, which would make sense, right? When we're talking about making a man a warrior, they need to be without fear. So the performative act of slaying Fafnir, removing the Helm of Terror, and then gaining these manly accoutrements, right? He gets a sword, a shield, and the helmet. These marks of a grown man and warrior is indicative of this connection, right? And then Scandinavian nobles always wanted to connect themselves with Sigurdur and the Volsungar, and thus to Odin, right? It's a mark, so they always kind of created their family lines back to this. King Haakon says that he is the king. We use Volsungar to refer to him just as a Haiti for king, and we translate it, right? The lore of the Hordor spread along the course of and how the king entertained the glorious days. We use the word Volsungar. So even though there's no connection to Haakon Hakonarsson, in the family tree back to the Volsungs, were using that as a mark of their kings. Eric Blodhax is greeted by his ancestors, Sigmundur and Sinfjotli, when he enters into the afterlife in Eriksmal by Bragi. And so we see this key connection going on with wanting to connect to it. And then I mentioned this kind of transforms into this ritual of what makes one a true warrior, and it's fearlessness. So that's Terry Gunnell talking about Fafnir Maul. Sigurdur's triumph is he gets this numinous knowledge and power because he gets all of these. I want to keep wanting to say knightly equipment, which there are no knights during this time, but I've been translating Tristram Saga with the reading group, so I just keep thinking in that idea of spurs as that mark to say you're now an adult. Here it's a sword, a shield, and the helm of terror, whether literal or figurative. But he's also in this, what modern audience would say bizarre. After he kills Fafnir, he's like, all right, now let me tell you why the world exists and walk you through the runes as this giant dragon is bleeding to death. And it's because he's gaining this numinous knowledge, this knowledge necessary for a leader, for a great warrior or adult. These terrifying eyes are a mark of nobility. The spreading of terror by wearing the helm, right? That's when we're directing our dragon eyes, our snake eyes, our terror, by wearing the helmet, the Aegishjálmr, which encircles all of their troops. There's this idea of like mantling themselves and their people that the king does with the Aegishjálmr as he leads them into battle. And Arnbjarnarkvi, Egil says, Thara Atlvalder und Aegishjálmi, right? Beneath his helmet of terror, he ruled the land. Speaking of Eric Blodhax. And he, of course, Eric's brow, he has these serpent-like eyes with an awesome glow. So we see both serpent eyes and the helm of terror, which Eric Bloodaxe uses to make sure that no one rises up against him. It doesn't work, right? He loses Jorvik, the kingdom, and returns in disgrace. And Egil picks fights with him because he picks fights with everybody that's in power. And then Haraldur Harfagri, right, famous king, he used the Hjálmtamíðar Hilmir Holmreiðr. He used the helmet of the island salmon, which is a great kinning for the helm of terror. He had the fierce mast-heart moored at the stake for the shore. So as he leads them into battle, he puts on the helmet of terror to instill fear in his opponents and protect his own men. Magnus and Gothi in the same way has the helmet of terror. And they said that your enemies faltered. He's expressing this against them. Your enemies were hreidir. They were forced, fearful to save their lives. Einar Skulason, to some king whom we don't know, because this is only shows up in Snorri, talking about Skaldic lines. Snauks, our favorite word here, Berfaldo Fryknu, the headdress of the serpent, the guardian of the people wears on his heroic mountain of hair, to connect them. And then Jarl Sigurdur's son, by Einar Skalagam, he's wearing the helmet of the island fetter, right? So they always wear this when he goes out to meet the Danish rulers, Håkon Håkonarson. And if you want me to pause on any of these, I will. I just trying not to slow and go through every one, and we're happy to go back.
Great examples.
Yeah. King Håkon is clad in the helmet of the compensation pollock, which is a wonderful kinning for the Aegishjálmr, right? Because it's focused, that compensation is like that weregild, right? This blood vengeance that he's wearing on his head as he wears the battle dare governs the rocky seat of sovereigns. Everyone's terrified of him. Another one for Håkon, most of the later ones, he's hooded, Falden with the Aegishjálmi. He's hooded with the mantle, the helm of terror. Again, he has got the Ygshjálmi. Here we had to make it monosyllabic, otherwise the line didn't work. So we create a new form of Aegishjálmr to Ygshjálmi. The tremendously generous ruler advanced under the helmet of terror ahead of the standards. So this is like the king, in showing his greatness, leads the troops from the forefront, instills fear in the enemy so that they break and fall apart, and then that leads them to victory. Sturla Thordarson loves this kinning. So he also said the Holmreiðr Hjálmi Falden, hooded in the helmet of the island Char. The enemies of the Lord fell. And so we see this connection, the helm of terror and the dragon eyes, they're connected, but they are separate. The dragon eyes refer to his fearlessness and watchfulness of his kingdom. The helmet of terror seems to be almost like a mantle or a stature that he puts on when going to war, or in Eric Bloodaxe's case, as put forward by Ed Skapta when he's ruling with an iron fist to keep people under his reign. And so it's really fascinating how we're kind of using that. And then the one caveat I will give is, after Haraldr Harfagri, post conversion to Christianity, everyone stops using this to describe kings, Christian kings, until Snorri and his nephew Sturla start resurrecting it while they're in the process of trying to save Skaldic poetry in Norwegian courts. So we have kind of an overabundance of it when we're bringing it back. Is no, this is how we want to describe kings, as great in wearing the helmet of terror. And it sadly doesn't work. Haakon is like, I would rather hear more about French romance. But so that's kind of this big Skaldic connection we see of the Helm of Terror and these serpentine eyes.
It's also interesting that you see fish come up so much in kinnings that involve serpents. I suspect that probably has to do with the reflectiveness of the scales, maybe some sense of the movement being similar.
Yeah, seems to be connected with movement. They both wriggle, and the shininess of the scales both seem to connect to them. Right, we always have a problem kind of using modern taxonomy. We're like reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals. And that's not how the ancient world's taxonomy works. Fish and reptiles seem to be a lot closer in their mind. And the rules as Snorri lays them out is you're allowed to use fish for snakes and snakes for fish when you're constructing this flipped kinning. And then the char here, the Rayther, is noted for its hooked mouth, which is something I brought up. So like why we want to choose this specific fish versus the pollock, which is a food fish, and we're talking about wealth, and the compensation pollock was this one, the Gjaldsaiths. Right, so I'm not gonna. I have not had the chance to do the deep dive in these that I did with Thjodolfr's poem, which did take me. I think I spent about 15 hours on that Thjodolfr poem to try and tease out everything going on, which is exactly what Skalds want us to do, right? Memorize their poems and spend hours poring over them to figure out all the twists and turns. So clearly, Thjodolfr did a good job there. I haven't done as much with all of the kinning stuff going on here with the Aegis Hjalmar. I think there's definitely still some work to be done there.
And in the comments here, Vicky asks, the hooded helmet makes me think of some species of snakes that are hooded like a cobra. Is there any chance of a connection there?
So there are no cobras, thankfully, up in Scandinavia, but all snakes that are venomous, when they take a defensive posture, will widen their head and make it more triangular. Right, snakes tend to have, let me go back to some snake pictures and see if I've got one demonstrating this. So the hoodedness could refer to the unfurling of a snake's head. So you can't see it here because he's tucked in. I have a lot of snake pictures, so it's.
I mean, I can grab a snake. There's 3 within 7 yards of me.
I'm sure I've got a snake out in my bush. I'm sure I could, if I went hunting for a smidge, we could catch him. So see, he's got a very narrow head here when he's not in a defensive posture. They've got a smooth, streamlined head, and then when they try and bite, we get this triangular shape. He's obviously swallowing, but their heads, vipers' heads widen. The adder, the viper's head widen when they're taking that defensive posture and opening their mouth. So the hood very much could embody this idea of ready to strike from a snake, even without being the cobra hood, which we know so well. But they're all doing the same thing, which is make them look bigger and scarier, because snakes don't like biting if they don't have to, except for water moccasins. They're just mean. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell that fascinating bit of the Helm of Terror and Norwegian. I say Norwegian, but also we've got some Swedish, just Scandinavian rulers, because it's not just kings, it's also the jarls. It's that mark of nobility and the fearlessness that's required for a great leader in that kind of honor-based culture that they really seem to be connecting it to in a fascinating way.
And they often seem to connect that ferocity in the eyes with nobility, period. I mean, looking at Ragnar Saga Lothbrokar isn't one of the things that gets actually recognized as not being the servant she's pretending to be, Kraka, that she has, it may not say snake-like, but something like fierce, noble eyes.
Yeah, she has terrifying eyes, the fierce eyes of a noble,
Yeah.
which again probably means snake-like eyes. They're just not explicitly saying it there. But she's also the daughter of Sigurður. So we know that once you consume dragon blood, it's genetically transferred in the Scandinavian world. Most famously with Hotgerðr, who's descended from Gudrun. She's got that cold temper of one who's eaten the dragon's heart, that when she repays Gunnar after 10 years of quiet, and causes his death. So they seem to understand that this trait, whether it was gained by slaying a dragon or whatever, was passed on to their children, and why all of Ragnar's kids have snake problems. Right? Ivar either doesn't have legs or doesn't have bones. I love how we don't know which one it actually was originally.
Or doesn't have potency, right? I mean, that's actually what it's described as in the Thaltr.
But then there's the other one where boneless means that his bones are like the snapped sinews and he's bendy like a snake. And he goes in that kind of warp spasm that Hulin is famous for in the Irish, where he's flinging all over the battlefield. And then one of them's got all white skin and they're immune to iron, right? All these kind of marks of dragons and snakes go to his kids and then continue onwards.
Yeah. Snake in the eye. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, part of what's so interesting as you're describing here is that if you casually read this literature, or even attentively read it without having this pointed out to you, you can really miss just how many snakes there are, or how many references and allusions there are to serpents. And once you point it out, you do see this stuff kind of everywhere, and in some surprisingly major spots. And then, I mean, there's even some that you haven't specifically mentioned very much. I mean, Gunnlaugur Ormstunga.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a lot going on with him being said to have a serpent's tongue. Not just that he has a sharp or insulting tongue, but that he has a perhaps noble tongue, right? He's able to compose poetry of a very noble form. And even though the only characters who are persistently serpents, Midgard, Solmer, and Fafnir, are on the negative side of the ledger, they do come up quite a bit on the positive, just as wolves do, right? Even though wolf characters tend to be negative, for a person being named wolf or something is not negative.
It's a fascinating problem. I say problem. It's a fascinating dichotomy because dragons are always evil. There is no good dragon, despite what Dungeons and Dragons and things would tell us now. And in the Norse world, dragons are always evil, but dragon qualities are usually positive, other than greed, which is really, as we noted, not an originally dragon quality. It's probably more brought in with the continental stuff that we're seeing. But like watchfulness, fearlessness, strength, all of these are like powerful tongue, way with words. All of these are really positive traits. And I guess that kind of really fits with Odin, who's always a play both sides of the field character, right? He's always good, but is he evil? He's always in both worlds. There's a very liminal nature, which is, I think, snakes are liminal, right? They live in caves, they climb up trees, they swim, they crawl. They kind of defy a simple categorization compared to many other creatures.
And I'm also thinking, just where they come up in names. They do come up some. And one of the places they come up pretty prominently is Guttormr, who kills Sigurdur. And of course, Sigurdur's eyes are part of what terrify him. So that's part of Sigurdur's snake connection.
Yeah, they have to wait for him to be asleep because you can't look in those eyes.
Yeah, very much that snake-like open eye during sleep. There's a lot here. Well, I've
Yeah,
really
no, it's
appreciated the presentation and the way that I mean, all the examples from Skaldic poetry were amazing. I mean, you do a really good job of showing just how well these motifs do run through everywhere.
well, I cannot thank the Skaldic poetry project enough for making it easy for me to kind of index and find these. It would have been a nightmare before.
Well, that's why they
But
made
yeah,
it.
it's what?
I said that's why they made it, was to make
Yeah,
it
yeah.
easier to
No, they
decode.
they did a great job, and obviously I'm biased because Taryn was one of my supervisors.
That's
Um,
great.
but no, they're phenomenal resources because Skaldic poetry has such a high barrier of entry to like really like process it at a literary level. Um, and this is really helping break it down because they'll give you every reference to the Kinnings and they'll put it all together for you. Because it's such a deep well that we can keep going back to and finding so much useful information from. And so that's kind of what I really like to highlight, both in my mythic dragon stuff and with these Norwegian kings, that these skalds all understand what they're doing and they're using these things over and over again. So even if it's not showing up in the written saga literature, the culture around it is very powerful and prominent. It's just fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, other questions, remarks from the audience? I haven't seen anything else come up. Well, I've really appreciated this, like I said, and I think it'd be great to have you back and talk a little bit more about dragons on another occasion if you'd be
Yeah,
interested.
dude. Whenever I listen, you can never get me to stop talking about dragons. So we didn't even touch on romance or Christianity and what they do. I've got another 43 slides after this.
Okay. I mean, that tells me that to me that's a whole other talk.
Yeah,
Stella does ask, just to clarify, we shouldn't assume the Helm of Terror is an actual helmet, correct?
correct. So I would argue that the Helm of Terror is much more of an idea, like a mantle put on, a figurative mantle put on by the leaders. That does not mean that the depiction of whatever creature is on the spine of like the Vindel helmets could be iconographically a serpent in order to represent the Helm of Terror as an idea. Right? Because we've always got those unblinking eyes at the tip of like the Sutnu helmet and some of the other ones. So that we may have them depicted on helmets, but there is no one magical helmet that was passed down physically, unless we're in Tolkien, because the Helm of Hador is Tolkien's interpretation. The Dragon Helm of Dor Lomin is Tolkien's take on the Aegis Hjelmer that he gives to Thorin Thorinbar, which is actually where this whole Norwegian kingship started for me. As I was teaching the Silmarillion, I was like, wait a minute, he's making some oddly Rigstula connected statements here, and I worked on that one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I hadn't made the. I every bit of the Turin story that I've ever seen has made me think of, either the Volsung's mythos or the Kalevala. And
Yeah,
well, there's
and I
one
think
more
those are
that
the obvious, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Those are the strongest connections. But when he makes the House of Hador specifically, he follows the description of Jarl and Rigstula to a T for all of the house. These blonde-haired Jarls with snake terrifying eyes, and every one of them are marked with their eyes driving people. And then the Dragon Helm of Dor Lomain, which they put on when they go into battle to terrify their enemies, is what they utilize against them. And so
okay.
that's the thing with Tolkien, is he's always going deeper. You're always just like, he beat me to figuring out this idea.
Good company to be in.
Yeah,
Well,
for
that's
sure.
cool. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank
And
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
all right, well, I'll get this up on YouTube before long. And now, thank you, Patreon. Thank you for your support and participation. And wish everybody all the best.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.